Welcome, friends, to China World Report, where today I have the pleasure to introduce a distinguished guest, Mr. Lawrence Peake, who is an accomplished businessman as well as a researcher in geopolitics and macroeconomics. And I will introduce Mr. Lawrence Peake to you now.
Lawrence P. was born in Shanghai in 1942. He moved to Brazil with his family in 1952, where he made a name for himself in the business world, leading the Moinho Pacifico Group, one of the largest wheat processors in Latin America. He studied philosophy in the United States, specializing in the works of Jean-Paul Sartre. After 50 years in business, he became a renowned expert in geopolitics and macroeconomics, focusing on relations between China and the United States.
Mr. Lawrence, welcome to China World Report. It's a pleasure to have you here. And the world seems like is in a very weird place and at a crossroads, many would say, in terms of geopolitics, macroeconomics, conflicts all over. And I'd like to begin our interview by asking you this. With tensions rising between the US, China, Russia, and Iran, how do you foresee the balance of power evolving globally in the near future?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you, Italo.
Thank you, sir.
The geopolitical situation is very complex today, as we have witnessed in the past years. And the tension is rising definitely between, on the one hand, China and Russia, and perhaps Iran, and now even North Korea. And on the other hand, you have the Western powers, basically led by the United States of America, with their European allies and NATO. So we are in a situation where it appears that tension is rising. I think that dialogues is becoming very difficult between the two camps. And we have to be very careful and hope that our leaders have the wisdom to navigate very, very carefully these very treacherous waters. It seems to me that the West is still with the mindset of the colonial era, and they still want to dominate the dialogue and the rules and how the world should be run. So at the same time, you are having a different polar a different pole, I would say, that I would say that it could be led by China or Russia and some of the emerging powers. So we have I wouldn't say an outright conflict yet, but the trend is definitely very disconcerting. So we hope that the leaders will have the wisdom to tone down the rhetoric, tone down the narrative, and somehow increase the probability and the possibility of a dialogue.
So as a good segue, how do you see these conflicts? How, do you see them possibly leading to new alliances or a reconfiguration of the global balance of power and the global security structure?
I think that's already in play right now. I see it in one camp, the traditional Western alliance. Economically, we can call it the G7, and militarily, we can call it the NATO. So we have this one camp, and I think that they would pursue their objectives and their particular view of the world and how it should be shaped and how the rules and the laws of the world should be governed, and essentially by their motto. And on the other hand, you have another group that I wouldn't say is outright challenging the West. However, they would like to provide an alternative to the global South, which I call the global majority. So you have a division of a different way of looking at the world and how the universal laws should be governed and how they should be applicable to each country that obviously will have their own interest in mind also. So we have a division right now, and let's see what happens and how it trends forward from now on.
So, as a good segue to that as well, considering a multipolar world order that is being shaped, that is being clearly created right now, how do you see institutions like the UN, the WTO, and the IMF? How do you see their ability to manage global crises effectively? What is their role from now on?
The multilateral institutions are very fragile, and they are being fragilized with each passing day. You see that some of the Western power, particularly the United States of America, has left for practical purpose the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the Paris Accord, the Tokyo Protocol, and they were never a member of the UNCLOS, which is the rule of the law of the seas. So you see that West, particularly the United States of America, has fronted on all the multilateral rules that was supposed to govern the world and from an international perspective. So I see that this is very fragilized in some ways, and I do not see how these institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or even the UN will have any clout in guiding the rules of how countries should behave with one another. So there's a fragmentation definitely going on. And on the other hand, you see that led by China, you see that some institutions are being built. One of them is that pops up is the Belt and Road Initiative. And you see that China is also moving to somehow bring Africa on board to the uh, group that's China is beginning to try to organize. And so you see that there are competing models at play, and we will see what happens and how the West will react to this new, I would say, not challenge, but a new alternative to the world. And we saw that lately the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which gathered many leaders, I think about 20 world leaders, and many countries are now on board or willing to be on board the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And all this leads me to believe that there is a new world order in the sense that it's an alternative for countries to choose, not necessarily a line, but an alternative to also hedge their bets on the other side. And this is what's being constructed right now. And I do believe that in time, you will see a weakening of the traditional multilateral institutions like IMF and World Bank and other institutions that have dominated the discourse, the narrative, and the rules for many decades.
Bigger picture kind of view, a bird's eye view. How do you see how sustainable do you think that the Western liberal democracy model as a global model for the rule of law, for the way countries should operate, particularly in the global South? How do you see it as a sustainable, or do you see that countries will opt more for this alternative as you clearly say, and as we can all see, is emerging? Do you see it as a sustainable model?
First of all, when you speak of rule of law and liberal democracy, we need to define what we mean by liberal democracy. The countries that dish out the narrative that it is a rule of law and also a liberal democracy, the question is that what is democracy and how do they see democracy? We all realize that there are very different levels in interpretation and understanding of what democracy is, first of all. Democracy is a word derivative from the Greek words demokratos, which essentially means that the rule of the majority. And if you look at carefully at the Western countries, you don't really see the rule of law, and you don't really see democracy either. So this is the first question that I have. What do they mean by rule of law and democracy? You see a trend in all no, but many Western countries. For example, Italy, you have a right-wing government. France, you have the possibility of Marie Le Pen becoming the leader of France. You see the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, which is right wing. You see some Baltic and Balkan countries, which are also right wing. And you see that in Great Britain, the Tory lost to the Workers' Party or Liberals. And as a result, we have Starmer, Keir Starmer, and he seems to be losing popularity too. And another pivot back to Tory is not impossible. And of course, the United States of America, we have Mr. Donald Trump, which is obviously to the right. And so you have all this movement that will challenge the, first of all, rule of law, and second, we will challenge what the Western uh, countries understand as liberal democracy. We see very strange situations like United States of America, where the majority cannot elect a president. In fact, Mr. Bush uh, Bush too, and Mr. Trump were elected uh, by a minority, actually, which is a very, very, very interesting way to interpret and to understand what democracy is all about. So we have an erosion of what democracy is in Western countries by their own definition. And it's a trend that is here in Brazil. We see that every single day. We see that the right wing has attempted a coup, and they are being tried in the courts. And you see that there is a movement by the United States government, actually the Trump administration, to support a past government that has attempted a coup against the state, against the rule of law, against everything that we know that we define as democracy. So there is a trend worldwide in the Western powers that we will have more authoritarian governments coming up, and we will see how that will play out in time.
Well, I think the Trump administration supporting a government that has attempted a coup is no surprise there, right? Considering January 6th and everything that they have done as well. Unfortunate set of circumstances. And also, in connection to this, I see with this rise of nationalism, how should countries balance the idea of globalization, the idea of an interconnected international community, of international norms, international laws? How should countries balance this with this rising surge of nationalism, specifically in Europe and the United States?
Well, nationalism is the policy of United States America with Mr. Trump, and it's America first and make America great again. This is clearly nationalistic, and to a certain extent, isolationist also. There's nothing wrong for the American leadership to want to rebuild America, to make America great again, and America first. I think that every country looks towards its own interest in world affairs, and that's perfectly acceptable and understandable also. The problem is that when you begin to propose this narrative, you will step on the interests of other countries. And depending on how you do it, it could be an overreach, which will isolate yourself in the world context. When we speak of a multipolar world, we don't really mean that the great powers will not have influence. They will always have influence. And this is just a fact of life. The great powers will always have more influence than the medium powers or the smaller countries. So they will exert pressure on the other countries, likely, to at least look after their own interest. The problem is that how far you go and to what extent you do and what you do to assert yourself and to continue to be able to, I would say, continue with the hegemonic policy that the United States of America has been uh, performing since the Second World War. And that's because the United States can do it because it's the most powerful country in the world until recently. So we can expect that the MAGA, Make America Great Again, and the policy of America First will continue. To what extent they will step on the rights and the interests of other countries rest to be seen. If it's excessive, then there will be a reaction. And I believe that in some ways, it's already happening. Insofar as overreaching is concerned, I believe that countries will react if it's excessive. And we're seeing this right now. The BRICS Association, actually we call it BRIC Plus today, which has already about 20 members and partners, and it will grow. We see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also increasing. So you see that it's being constructed an alternative to what we understand is the US hegemony for over 40 years, actually since the Second World War, and more pronounced since 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Considering also keeping on that topic of overreach, we see the application of sanctions as a tool, as a geopolitical tool of influence, I guess. Do you see that the sanctions that the US and the EU, just to some extent, have imposed on countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, do they achieve their desired goals or do they end up creating just stronger anti-Western feelings?
Well, sanctions have never been very effective. The sanctions are supposed to be against the leadership and in hopes that the people will revolt against the leadership and there will be a change in leadership. However, it seems that with sanctions, the leaderships have consolidated the power, in fact, and I don't see any case that has been successful in the regime change through sanctions. I'm specifically referring to economic sanctions, not military actions. So it's not very effective. And those countries that are sanctioned are gathering together. They're bunching up together to resist the sanctions. And as the United States of America, which has shown egregious appetite for sanctions, is beginning to lose its clout. And economic sanctions are effective in bringing about economic chaos in another country. But countries are learning how to live with it, first of all. And second is that the US overreach is beginning to falter. When you are a country that is the leader in manufacturing, sanctions are effective. And if you are a country that has dominated the financial system, you also have a lot of clout. However, insofar as manufacturing is concerned, U.S. is no longer a superpower, much to the contrary. And also insofar as the financial sector or the overpowering weight of the US dollar is beginning to erode. And you see that the BRICS countries are beginning to trade in their own currency. And many countries are questioning why do we need to use the dollar, bilateral transactions. So you see a decline of the importance of dollar and it will continue. And I believe that this will only accelerate with time. So the instruments that the US uses, and to a certain extent, Europe also, of sanctions are beginning to be degraded and they have every day less effect to the point that when it's no longer effective, then the instruments and the mechanisms that the West has to pressure other countries will be eroded. So, and this is an irreversible trend. And I believe that in the 10, 15 years, the financial sanctions will no longer be effective at all. And unless the West can regain their manufacturing prowess, uh, even sanctions in trade will have very little effect. So this is a trend that I believe is irreversible, and every day the sanctions will have less and less importance.
And there's, I think, a natural continuation of the logic you have just expounded. What do you think is the strategic importance of the recent expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
I think it's a message that there are alternatives to the Western-led system, and I wouldn't say alliance, but a partnership, perhaps. That there's an alternative that you do not have to hedge all your bets on one side, that you can hedge your bets. And the models are very different. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not impose and does not dictate that who calls the shots. It's much more open, and in some ways, we can even call it much more democratic. And so I believe that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will increase in appeal to many countries, particularly to the global majority. Um, I do not believe that it is a challenge to the US hegemonic system or framework, but often an alternative to countries that do not want to align with one particular camp. So countries can not necessarily align with the West, but it can also take part in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I believe that this will balance the two systems and will offer a viable alternative for many countries.
And seeing this growth, this strengthening, we can say, as was evidenced by the military parade, that was a glorious military parade, by the way, that was held in Beijing on September 3rd, where we could see these members of many of the prominent members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as other prominent members of the Global South, all united in a what can only be described as a show of force. What message do you think that Beijing was trying to send with this parade, with this show of force, with this show of unity?
We can recall Deng Xiaoping's saying that hide your strength and bide your time. Well, if you come to the stage of development of military, economic, manufacturing uh, level and stage that China has reached, it is impossible to hide anymore. And the message that the Chinese government wants to give to the world is that China is here and China is here to stay. So the US has always been remarkably efficient in exerting military power. It has approximately 80 military installations around the world, outspends militarily than almost any country in the world. In fact, every country in the world. I believe that the total amount that the U.S. Government spends in military is approximately $1.5 trillion yearly, and that includes all the assistance to the veterans, etc., not only for military hardware and for personnel. And so it is it's taxing to the American taxpayer, of course, and to sustain 800 military installations around the world is very costly. But this is sort of part of being the world policeman that they have sought to play that role for quite a few decades now. And China is saying that, sending the message that, you have encircled our country with over 100 bases, and two of your largest bases are our neighbors, basically Japan and South Korea. And the third is in Germany, but that's in Europe. So we understand that you are encircling our country and that we are concerned that you have been so outrightly aggressive in trying to contain our country. But despite of all the efforts that you've made to try to contain China, we are today a military superpower, and we are able to defend ourselves against any external threat. And we see you as an external threat simply by the fact that you encircle our country and you provoke us relentlessly in the South China Sea and otherwise. So this is the Chinese view of what the United States of America is doing right now. And as a result, they are building up their military at a very fast pace. What is interesting is the nuclear triad, which means that the Chinese military can now deliver nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads to anywhere in the world. And this is a what they understand as the deterrence. If you look at the numbers, Russia today has the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads, approximately 6,000 units. And the United States of America has around 5,500. And China has probably between 600 and 700 only. So you see the disparity between the nuclear capability, and this is one reason why China, in the past 2 or 3 years, has began a new program of upgrading their nuclear capability, so that they will be able to strike back at any attack by another power. And as you realize that China has the no first use policy, and that implicit is that China will never ever use nuclear power against a non-nuclear country. So that leaves very few countries that China would eventually target if struck first. And 3 or 4 that are very closely aligned to the United States of America are UK, France, and Israel, which are very close, have very close relationship with the United States of America. So China has sent a message, a clear message that we are ready for a second strike. And this is a chilling message to the West. Another thing that's important in this military display is China's capability in deterring a U.S. Aircraft carrier fleet of penetrating the first island chain and even maybe the second island chain. And with this highly developed hypersonic weaponry, missiles, and what they call the FOBs, which is a fractional orbital bombardment system, it is clear that China is able to deter uh, any aggressive move by the U.S. 11 formidable 11 aircraft carrier fleets. So China has come to the conclusion that the new warfare that may happen in the coming years will be a very different war from the past, and drones will be effective. Artificial intelligence will be critical, and also the air defense system will be critical also. Many specialists have said that China hasn't fought a war since the 1970s, and this is true. They have no experience. But war in the Asian in the Asian contingency would be very different. It will first would be a very it would be a naval war to begin with. So the experience that United States of America in the past wars, they have no experience, just like China has no experience in this new kind of warfare. Two countries that do have experience are Ukraine and Russia. And I am quite certain that the Chinese military are in close contact with the Russian military to learn about how Russia is conducting their war in Ukraine. So you see that the message is quite clear. We are here. We are here to stay, and we will defend our national interest and our national sovereignty. So the message is quite clear. And what is most disconcerting to me is should Japan ever get involved in a Taiwan contingency? There has been a lot of bad blood between Japan and China, and we can go back to 1931, where the Japanese invaded China. Uh, China and Japan fought not a few years in the Second World War. The China-Japan War started in 1931 and dragged on long for 14 long years. And the most atrocious and the most barbaric atrocities were committed by the Japanese Imperial Army on the Chinese people. So there's a lot of bad blood between China and Japan. And you see the message of this parade, military parade and display, is that they said that there's a victory against Japanese fascism. And that's a clear message to Japan. So my fear, and I dread even to think about the outcome, that should Japan be involved in a Taiwan contingency, this ill feeling of the Chinese leadership and of Chinese people may emerge, and that could be absolutely devastating for Japan. So I'm very worried, and I hope that countries will find a way to iron out their differences so that they will no longer be the threat of a war, and it may escalate. As we realize that wars start, but we never know how they end. So here's are my deep concerns of what's happening in the geopolitical tension around the world.
I think that's very well said, sir, about how wars start, but we never know how they end. And I think as a connection to that, we see the encirclement, as you said, of in terms of military bases of the United States, or how China feels that the U.S. is encircling it. I think we can use a parallel that with Russia also, and how the Ukraine conflict started. How do you see the long-term consequences of this conflict that's ongoing in Ukraine for over now 3 years? How do you see it affecting Europe and West Asia's, and as well as China's security and basically geopolitical structure and stability?
See the Ukraine war, which the Russians call it a special military operation. I see that the how it all started was predictable. Even U.S. Analysts and diplomatic people said that it was unwise for U.S. to continue expanding NATO and getting closer and closer to the Russian border. You have to realize that in history, Russia has been invaded, and more recently, in recent centuries, invaded by Napoleon and invaded by Germany. So Russia is obviously, understandably skeptical when you see all these nations joining NATO and being armed by the Western powers, particularly United States of America. And the United States has a Monroe Doctrine, which effectively says that don't ever dare to come to our backyard. And actually, we saw the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that almost led to nuclear confrontation. And it was because the Russians, then Soviet Union, installed and missiles in Cuba. And the Americans absolutely did not accept that. So it's not quite clear why the Americans would believe that the Russians would accept NATO countries with missiles and military hardware and personnel on the border of Russia. In fact, if you look at it, Cuba is separated from the United States by sea, but NATO allies is on the border of Russia. So it's understandable that the Russians would be skeptical. In 1991, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred, it was an agreement was actually made between the West and Russia that the Western powers, particularly NATO, would not encroach, or as they said, as James Baker said, the then Secretary of State would not move 1 inch towards Russia. And with that, the Russians agreed to remove their troops from West Germany and accept the reunification of Germany. But unfortunately, the West did not live up to their commitment, and they kept on increasing the members of NATO. In 1991, there were about 14 countries in NATO. Today, there are 32. So it's understandable why there's some skepticism and fear by the Russians. And this is the war in Ukraine has been going on for 3.5 years now. And it seems that the Russians have a clear upper hand. Mr. Trump definitely wants to end the Ukraine war, and that is definitely to his credit. But it is difficult to convince the European powers that the war should end with the Russians having the upper hand, because there is an innate fear and aversion of Russia by the European powers. They fear Russia, and we call it Russophobia. But it goes way beyond that. It's not only Russophobia, it's actually the hatred of the Russians, particularly the communist regime. So it's understandable that the Western European countries are skeptical, and of course the Balkan and Baltics countries that were once controlled uh, in many ways by the Russians under the Soviet Union. Uh, so it's understandable that these countries are also skeptical. But Russia is a powerful country. It's a huge country. It has tremendous natural resources. It's more natural resources than the United States of America and China put together. It's 146 million people. And if Russia is allowed to dominate Europe or be the most important country in Europe, which is why Russia was never accepted to European Union nor to NATO, and Russia has in fact requested to be accepted to European Union and NATO, but that was not to the interests of neither the European countries, such as the three major European countries are France, Germany, and Great Britain. These three countries will absolutely be against the more powerful Russia in Europe. So in the past, in history, you go back to history, you can see that Western Europe never really accepted Russia as part of Europe. And if Russia were to become a part of, let's say, Europe, they will always be considered second-class citizens of Europe, just like the Western Europe considers the Balkan and Baltic state Europeans are second-class Europeans. And this will not change because it's ingrained in the psyche, the collective psyche of Western Europe. So to understand what's happening in Europe, we have to accept that Western Europe will not accept a powerful Russia, and Russia will need to be powerful to defend its own interests. So it's going to be very difficult, and you can see that the Europeans are absolutely against any agreement that Mr. Trump has been trying to broker between Ukraine and Russia. And so we will see how it plays out. But militarily, there's very little chance that Ukraine can survive. And the longer it takes, the better for Russia, because every single day they are managing to move to acquire more territory from Ukraine. And it's a very complex situation, but it definitely does not look good for Europe, Western Europe, particularly in light of the what's happening to the economies, which is faltering, and they are in very serious trouble. They are basically, I would say, social democratic countries that the role of the state is very important in providing the basic needs of the people, such as education, healthcare, etc. They are welfare states, and European population are seeing that these welfare policies are being eroding, and they have spent so much during the war to supply Ukraine with military hardware. So we have a situation in that Russia is on the path. They've built a war economy, and Europe has not. Now, Mr. Trump has repeatedly, insistently uh, pressured Europe to spend more in the military. And now Mr. Trump wants Europe to spend 5% of their GDP in the military, 3.5% in hardware, and 1.5% in infrastructure. I'm not sure where the European countries will get the money from. If you look at carefully at the European economies, they are actually faltering, and you even see the former locomotive of Europe, which is Germany. Germany today is not even the shadow of what it was before. Germany had three enormous advantages, which is cheap Russian energy, the military umbrella, U.S. military umbrella, and China as its enormous market for German products. Today, they no longer have cheap Russian energy. The Americans want them to spend more, and the U.S. is basically removing the military umbrella. And China is not no longer a market for Germany. Worse, it's become a competitor. So Europe is in dire straits, without a doubt. And the sooner Mr. Zelensky, uh, whose term has actually expired, so constitutionally or legally speaking, he's no longer the leader should not be the leader of Ukraine. If he decides to make peace with Russia and accept the relatively harsh terms that the Russians demand, then he will probably lose more territory. The outcome is very, very, very grim for Ukraine. And my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people that has been sold a narrative that Ukraine could win a war against Russia by the Zelensky government. And this is where we stand today.
I think we can safely say that there's a huge parallel between Zelensky and people like Bibi Netanyahu, who can only remain in power because the war hasn't ended, and that's their only chance of maintaining whatever power they hold. and it's a very unfortunate situation. The Ukrainian people certainly do not deserve this situation. It's just, as you said, dire straits. And tied into that, how do you see that this conflict, or do you see that? Do you think it's fair to say that this conflict in Ukraine has strengthened China's position as a global superpower? And if so, how?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it has strengthened China as a global superpower. China's status as a global superpower is irreversible and it will only increase with or without Ukraine. What is important to understand is that the US has dedicated a lot of energy and resources in the Ukraine war, and that has somehow depleted US military stockpile, and it's a risk for the United States of America if the United States of America should ever be in a conflict with China, military conflict, or if things get kinetic. So my view is that China um, wants peace in Ukraine because this is the Chinese uh, project that the world should have peace and that prosperity is something that's good for mankind. And what China really wants is be able to trade. And since they are very competitive in manufacturing, it's to China's advantage that the globalization does not decrease any further than it already is. What China wants is prosperity for the Chinese people first, and then that if that somehow trickles to other country, that will be accepted by the Chinese leadership as something very, very positive. And this is why the Chinese government has always uh, uh, voiced their support of win-win policies that both countries can win together when they cooperate. So, but China has to be very careful with its past history of almost being colonized and the atrocities that was committed against the Chinese people and China as a country. They will remember that. And this collective psyche is deeply ingrained in the Chinese people. And what I can assure you is that the Chinese people will never, ever let what has happened in the past 200 years to China to happen again. So, answering your question is that it will strengthen China. Uh, I don't think that it makes that much difference. Regardless of what happens in Ukraine, China will continue to improve and expand its military, will continue to trade with more and more countries, and continue to use its ability and its ingenuity and work ethic of 1.4 billion people to make China a more powerful country geopolitically, economically, and also militarily. China has learned a lesson that China will never, ever forget. And the sooner the Western reconcile with this fact, we will have peace.
You mentioned, sir, the possibility of things going kinetic when speaking of China and the United States. How do you see the global balance of power shifting in case there is a conflict between China and Taiwan, which I guess indirectly would be a conflict between China and the United States?
I am not altogether sure that a Taiwan contingency would necessarily involve the United States of America. With the military display on September the 3rd, it's clear of China's capability. Let's assume that things get out of hand in the next 5 years until 2030. By then, China's military capability would be even greater than it is today. So, just some facts on the ground. China is developing its sixth generation jet fighters, and it seems that they are uh, close to success. China is building more nuclear submarines, which is critical for China to police its vicinity. And also, China is using AI and robotics with military ends. And I believe that China will be the most powerful military in the world in the not too distant future. One interesting fact is that China's naval shipbuilding capacity is over 230 times the United States of America. I repeat, 230 times that United States of America. So China's manufacturing sector is about 36 or 37% of GDP, whereas the United States of America is about 14. And given that China's economy is about 1.4% and larger than the United States of America, and the gap is growing and expected to be somewhere between 1.6 to 1.7 times larger than the United States of America by the end of this decade, it is clear that China will have more capability militarily due to the growth of its economy. So if you analyze it from a purely manufacturing point of view, China's today outproduces U.S. in manufacturing by fourfolds. So, as you know, in a war, what you need is hardware production. The faster and more you can produce military equipment, and the more people they have, personnel, you are likely to win the war. And this is part of the problem for the United States of America. And there's also the resilience. The Chinese people are accustomed to hardship and pain, and their threshold is much, much higher than the Americans. So it's not only military equipment, size of the economy, number of personnel, but also resilience and the resolute aspects resolve the resolve of Chinese China as a country and the resolve of U.S. as a country. From all these aspects, it's clear that U.S. has to be tread very, very carefully in the coming years. And so I do not believe that necessarily U.S. will back Taiwan because all these, what I'm saying that the U.S. military has far more information and far more analysis in depth than what I'm suggesting now. So I believe that the U.S. military will recognize that China is a formidable adversary, and it would be risky for them to interfere in the reunification of Taiwan with China. And what I can assure you is that China will most certainly reunite Taiwan one way or another. And this is a pledge that has been repeatedly done by the Chinese leadership, and it will not change. In fact, it has the support of practically unanimous support of the Chinese people. Um, what I believe is that in the event of a move by People's Republic of China on Taiwan would be to embargo and encircle Taiwan to choke its food, energy, uh, and communication networks so that essentially Taiwan is no longer operable as a country. And if the United States does not interfere, the Lai regime will collapse in less than a month. So I have no doubts that Taiwan will be reunited to China. And I hope that the Taiwan leadership, even under DPP, is sufficiently realistic to realize that it's simply unavoidable. And if they come to an agreement with China on a one country, two system, where they have some autonomy, some degree of autonomy, I think that would be the best solution for Taiwan. If there's a military conflict, Taiwan will see its fate exactly what's happening in Ukraine and worse, what's happening in Gaza today.
I think it's important to note that not only does reunification have the almost unanimous support of the Chinese population, but of over 30% of the actual Taiwanese population, somewhere between 20 to 30% of actual Taiwanese people do support reunification, according to some of the most recent polls. I think that's important to note. And considering the fact that clearly now China is the only other superpower left in the world, I think we can safely say that, it has exceeded Russia in terms of economy, of military might, and of projection of power, of clout, soft power, whatever you like to use as a metric. And considering that, as there's clearly only two big boys in the yard now, what is China's worst fear today as a superpower?
China's worst fear today is that U.S. should be more like China, and the other fear is that China should be more like U.S. So you come to your own conclusion.
That's going to be very hard to reconcile, I believe, these two becoming more like each other. Um, and to wrap it up, I'd like to ask you a question that is more of a global view, more of a bird's eye view of the state of the world as a whole, which I guess, in a sense, will transcend China, Russia, the United States, and basically the European Union and NATO. The doomsday clock, which is something that many scientists and many reputable people, researchers, use to determine how close the planet is to a self-inflicted end, or a global catastrophe, be it nuclear war, be it AI takeover, anything, things like that. Right now, in 2025, it stands at 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it has ever been historically, even more so than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why do you think that is, and how can we halt the advancement of this doomsday clock?
That's a very interesting question that we all should look at it very carefully. The doomsday clock actually is the was originated in a magazine called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947, if I recall correctly. And from then on, through successive measures, it has gone up and gone down, and actually started at 7 minutes in 1947. And today, it's a whole different story. The four uh, risks that this doomsday clock sees is the nuclear annihilation, the climate disaster, geopolitical disruption, um, and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence um, that could bring about either great progress or catastrophe. So these are the four risks that I believe that the doomsday clock monitors closely. It is to be remembered that in 19, I forget now exactly the date, but I think it was 1991 when the clock was at 17 minutes, and today is less than 2 minutes, actually to be exact, 89 seconds. So, and it's the closest to midnight, which means catastrophe, uh, since it began in 1947. So, according to the doomsday clock, we are very close to a catastrophic event in the world, and it's d- depends on the leadership and how they conduct and how they try to navigate these risks. Uh, in theory, it's so simple for the world to get along, for countries to get along, and yet we find it so difficult. And if we are 89 seconds from doomsday, and leaders go on their way as if nothing's happening. You have a hegemonic power, which the United States of America, that has, in this very short history of 250 years, conducted over 200 military operations, conflicts, or wars, and it has been at war 90% of its existence. So, and it has been the most powerful country for decades. So, what I would hope, which is a virtual impossibility, is that the world leaders come to an agreement and eliminate all nuclear weapons. I know that I'm dreaming, and this will not happen. But if this is possible, at least we can avert one very, very serious threat to humanity. Yeah. Um, I believe that people sometimes sleepwalk into disaster. And I'm seeing this today as it happens. You have to give credit to Mr. Trump because he at least is not a war hawk. You know? And whether he can somehow neutralize the deep state and the neocon is an open question. The fact that he's instilling and um, pushing America to a more autocratic system is definitely a enormous negative. But we also have to realize that he is definitely not in favor of war. You know? Although many in his cabinet are in favor of war. And the fact that the five major or principal military contractors and companies have their plants all over the United States of America gives them a lot of influence in the U.S. policy, foreign policy, and military doctrine also. So you have this industrial military complex, which Eisenhower and very wisely alerted us to. Is something that's very powerful in the United States of America, and how you dismantle that is very, very difficult, in my opinion. And along these lines, I also like to point out that the United States of America today is actually a plutocracy ruled by a very small majority, sorry, a very small minority of elites. I mean, the financial and economic elites. And the fact that you are able to virtually purchase influence with campaign donations, there's no limit. And corporations can do the same thing as individuals. Makes it very difficult for um, other sectors of the American society to have much influence. The most important thing for an elected politician is to worry about where his funding is going to be coming from for the next election. So, with this in mind, actually, you have a system that purchases influence and purchases power. You know? And this system, in my view at least, it's not that democratic. You know? And the fact that you can be elected president, even losing popular vote, is something also very weird. You know? In a democracy. So they are why the United States uh, can never develop or create a third viable party. It's simply because the system is has such a constraints that does not allow a third party to appear. It's the um, winner take all and first past the goalpost policies and the gerrymandering, etc., that makes it impossible for a third party to appear. I was even amused by Elon Musk's when he said that he wanted to form a third party. You know? With his wealth, is not. It's. I wouldn't say it's possible, but at least stands a better chance. But the American system is not going to change. It's going to be. It's a bipartisan system, and both parties have the same foreign policy, and foreign policy is what's going to get us into trouble if it's not very carefully formulated. And unfortunately, it's not the case with the United States of America, which it still has enormous power in the world today.
I guess since we're running out of time, it'll be a great topic for our future discussion. I love picking your brain, Mr. Lawrence P. It's a tremendous pleasure to have you here, and perhaps we can delve into the two-party dictatorship next time and the plutocracy and the inner workings of the United States and how it exerts, I think, at this point, an unwarranted amount of influence. I don't know if you'd agree with that last point, but I cannot thank you enough for coming on to China World Report for this first of our hopefully many interviews. And it's a pleasure to have you, and I sincerely hope to have you again.
Thank you very much, Italu.